I never thought I'd be the one to tell stories like this. For most of my life, I prided myself on being practical, common sense. I was the kind of woman who didn't jump at shadows or harbor foolish notions that the world was anything but what it was. But after 83 years in this world, I've learned that sometimes the most disturbing things aren't the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones who live right next door, wearing ordinary faces and waving from their front porches. These three stories span different decades of my life, different homes, different neighborhoods, but they're connected by a single thread: the uncomfortable realization that you never truly know the people you share a fence line with. The fact that the person who borrows your lawnmower might be hiding something terrifying behind their smile. That normalcy itself can be a disguise, carefully worn and just as easily discarded. I tell these stories now because my granddaughter asked me to. She's always been interested in the strange parts of my life, the parts I usually ignore at Sunday dinners. And now, here they are, three encounters with neighbors that changed the way I see the world and how I lock my doors at night. That was the first time I learned how wrong a friendly smile can be. The second story taught me something even darker. If you want to hear it, stay with me and make sure you're not listening alone. Before I begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a neighbor who made your skin crawl, even though you couldn't explain why? If you have, you might want to stay with me. And if these stories make you feel anything at all, consider leaving a like, so I know I'm not remembering them alone. The summer of 1967, I was 31 years old and living in a rental house on Maple Grove Lane in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It was a modest two-bedroom with yellow siding and a chain-link fence separating our yard from the property next door. My husband Frank worked at the John Deere plant, second shift, which meant he left at 2:30 in the afternoon and didn't return until past midnight. Our daughters, Linda, age 7, and Cheryl, age 4, were my world during those long evenings alone. The house next door had been vacant for 3 months when Mr. Oleander moved in. I remember the day clearly, June 14th, a Wednesday. The moving truck arrived at dawn, and by noon, everything was unloaded. I was hanging laundry on the line when I first saw him standing at the fence, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Afternoon," he said, raising one hand in greeting. "Tobias Oleander. Just moved in?" He was somewhere in his 50s, I guessed, with thinning hair the color of old newspaper and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the sunlight at odd angles. He wore brown slacks and a white undershirt, the kind with the ribbed texture, slightly yellowed at the collar. His face was narrow, almost gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed darker than they should have been. "Nice to meet you," I said, keeping my tone polite, but not warm. "I'm Dorothy. My husband Frank and I live here with our 2 girls." "2 girls?" he repeated, nodding slowly. How lovely. I imagine they keep you busy. They do. He stood there a moment longer, resting his hands on the fence posts, then smiled, a strange, tense expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. If you need anything, I'm here. As they say, good fences make good neighbors. Maybe I'm curious what you think. Was that just harmless small talk? Or would you have felt uneasy too? You can tell me in the comments. Sometimes it helps to hear another pair of eyes. I went back to hanging the sheets, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me for a few more seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward his house. Something about this encounter made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on the reason. Perhaps it was the phrase, "two girls," as if he was storing the information for later. Or maybe it was the awkwardness of meeting someone new, heightened by my own tendency to overthink. Frank dismissed my concerns when I mentioned it that night. "He's probably just lonely," he said, taking off his work boots in the kitchen. "Give him time to adjust. You'll hardly notice him." But I did notice him. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Oleander's presence became impossible to ignore. He was always out. He watered his small lawn, sat on his back steps with a mug of coffee, and trimmed the hedge that divided our houses with a soft, rhythmic clipper that I could hear through the windows. And he was always there when I went out with the girls. Most afternoons, Linda and Cheryl would play in the backyard, running by the fountain or drawing with sidewalk chalk on the concrete patio Frank had poured last summer. I'd sit on the porch steps with a glass of cold coffee, watching them fold laundry or shell green beans for dinner, and every time, within 5 or 10 minutes, Mr. Oleander would appear at the fence. "It's a beautiful day," he'd say, or "Your girls are growing up so fast," or "That big one there, she looks just like you." He never did anything overtly inappropriate. He never asked the girls to come closer or offered them candy. He never said anything that Frank or the police might call threatening. But there was something about the way he watched them, an intensity that made my skin tingle, as if he were deliberately watching my girls with such intensity. By mid-July, I started keeping the girls inside more often because I was starting to get really irritated by Mr. Oleander. I told her it was too hot to play outside in the afternoons, that they'd get sunburned, and that the mosquitoes were terrible this year. Linda protested, but Cheryl seemed to accept it without question. She was a quiet child, sensitive to her sister's moods, unlike her older sister. One evening in late July, I think it was the 11th, around 8:30 p.m., I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink. The window above the sink looked directly onto Mr. Oleander's backyard, and I'd gotten used to seeing him through the window at various times of the day. But something was different that evening. He was standing in his yard, motionless, staring directly at our house. Not at the window where I stood, but at the girls' bedroom window on the second floor. He stood there for what must have been 5 full minutes, utterly still, hands at his sides, his face tilted upward. The sun was setting behind him, casting his features into shadow, And from that angle, he looked less like a man and more like a dark cutout against the orange sky. I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked quickly upstairs. Linda and Cheryl were in their room, playing with their dolls on the braided rug between their beds. The curtains were open. From where I stood in the doorway, I could see Mr. Oleander still standing in the same position, his gaze fixed on that exact window. "Time to close these," I said, keeping my voice steady as I crossed the room and drew the curtains shut. "Why?" Linda asked. "It's not even dark yet." "Saves on air conditioning," I lied. "Keeps the heat out." That night, I told Frank what I'd seen. He listened, frowning, then walked to the window and peered through the curtains toward Mr. Oleander's house. The lights were on downstairs, but there was no sign of our neighbor. "Maybe he was just looking at something else," Frank said. "A bird on the roof. Or—" "He was looking at their window, Frank, for 5 minutes. Who does that?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll talk to him, friendly-like, neighbor to neighbor. Just let him know we've noticed him around, and we'd appreciate a little more space." "When?" "Tomorrow. I've got the morning shift. I'll catch him before I leave." But the next day, something happened that made Frank's conversation unnecessary, or perhaps impossible. I woke up around 6:15 a.m. to the sound of sirens. Not distant, but close. So close, the walls seemed to vibrate with the noise. I pulled on my robe and hurried downstairs, where Frank was already standing at the front door, looking out through the screen. 3 police cars were parked in front of Mr. Oleander's house. We stood there, watching, as 2 officers knocked on his door, waited, then knocked again. After a few minutes, one of them tried the doorknob. The door swung open. They went inside. Linda appeared beside me, rubbing her eyes. "What's happening, Mama?" "I don't know, honey. Go back upstairs." She didn't move. We all stood there, Frank, me, Linda, and eventually Cheryl, when she wandered down, watching through the screen door as the officers moved through Mr. Oleander's house. After about 20 minutes, they emerged, one of them speaking into a radio clipped to his shoulder. Then they brought out the boxes. Cardboard file boxes, the kind you'd use for office storage. 4 of them, carried out one at a time and loaded into the trunk of one of the police cars. The officers moved with a kind of grim efficiency that told me whatever they'd found was serious. Expected, even. A crowd had gathered on the street by then, other neighbors, drawn by the commotion. I saw Mrs. Haverty from 2 doors down, standing on her lawn in her pink housecoat, arms crossed over her chest. Mr. Brennan, the retired mailman who lived across the street, stood beside his mailbox, shaking his head. One of the officers, a young man with red hair and a mustache, walked over to where several of us had congregated near the sidewalk. "Any of you folks know Tobias Oleander well?" he asked. No one spoke at first. Then Mrs. Haverty said, "He moved in about a month ago. Kept to himself mostly." The officer nodded, writing something in a small notebook. "Did he ever approach any of your children? Try to talk to them or offer them anything?" My stomach dropped. Frank's hand found my shoulder. He watched my daughters, I said quietly, from his yard. He was always watching them. The officer's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or confirmation. Did he ever try to speak to them directly? No, but he watched every time they were outside. He wrote that down too. If you remember anything else, give us a call. He handed me a card with the police station's number printed on it. They finished loading the boxes and drove away. Mr. Oleander's door was left open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. We later gleaned the details from the news and gossip that quickly spread through the neighborhood. Tobias Oleander was wanted in 3 states for crimes I won't go into, except to say they involved children. Photos taken without his consent, surveillance. Boxes the police removed from his house contained evidence of his activities, not only in Cedar Falls, but also in towns where he had lived. He moved every few months, staying right ahead of the investigation, finding a new neighborhood where he could keep tabs on the children. Our street, with its young families and unfenced yards, was his latest hunting ground. 2 days later, he was arrested at a bus station in Omaha. To avoid prosecution, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. He served 8 years before dying of a heart attack in 1977. Even after I moved from Maple Grove Lane, I kept that officer's badge in my wallet for years. Sometimes I'd pull it out and look at it, remembering that article and how close we'd come to something much worse. That my instincts, those silent, persistent alarms I tried to dismiss as paranoia, had been right all along. Looking back, the most disturbing part wasn't even what Mr. Oleander was doing or planning to do. It was how normal he seemed, how easily he fit in, how he stood at that fence, making small talk about the weather while calculating those terrible things behind his wire-rimmed glasses. I was utterly astonished that someone so evil could be so unflappable. After that summer, I never again ignored my instincts about people. And I taught my daughters, and later my granddaughters, to do the same. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust that feeling. Lock your doors, close your curtains, and remember, monsters rarely look like monsters. They often look like neighbors. That was the first time I learned how wrong a friendly smile can be. The second story taught me something even darker. If you want to hear it, stay with me and make sure you're not listening alone. In 1982, Frank and I moved into a small apartment complex in Fort Madison, Iowa, right along the banks of the Mississippi River. Years of factory work had given Frank an early onset of emphysema, and his condition was steadily getting worse. Because of the mounting medical expenses, we had relocated to a 2-bedroom ground-floor unit in a 3-story building called Riverbend Apartments. By then, Linda and Cheryl were grown, married, and busy with families of their own. So most days, it was just the two of us rattling around in a place that felt too quiet for comfort. The apartment directly above us, Unit 4B, had been empty for several weeks when a new tenant finally moved in. It was a Saturday, October 16th. I remember because Frank and I had just returned from the grocery store when we heard furniture being dragged across the floor upstairs. Heavy, grinding sounds that made our light fixtures tremble. "Someone's moving in," Frank said, glancing up at the ceiling as he unloaded cans of soup into the cupboard. Truthfully, I felt relieved. The empty space and silence above us had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. That vacant apartment felt like a held breath, something oppressive and waiting. At least now, we'd have a neighbor again. Footsteps, a television murmuring, little reminders that we weren't alone in the building. The woman from 4B introduced herself 2 days later. I was collecting our mail from the metal boxes in the lobby when she appeared beside me, so quietly that I hadn't heard her approach. "You're in 3B, right?" she said. I turned, startled. She was at least 20 years younger than me, mid-40s maybe, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and pale skin that looked as though it rarely saw sunlight. She wore a gray cardigan over a white blouse, black slacks, and sensible flat shoes. Her face was pleasant enough, but ordinary in a way that made it easy to forget. "That's right," I said. "Dorothy Brennan. My husband, Frank, and I moved in last spring." "Margaret Dyer," she replied, extending her hand. Her grip was cold and firm. "I'm directly above you. If I get too noisy, please let me know. I'll do my best to keep it down." "You're fine," I assured her. "We hardly hear anything." At the time, that was true. But over the following days and weeks, I began to notice things about Margaret Dyer that struck me as odd, things I couldn't entirely explain. For one, she kept strange hours. I would hear her pacing around her apartment at 2 or 3 in the morning, footsteps moving from one end of the unit to the other, drawers opening and slamming shut, water running in the bathroom. Then, during the daytime, there would be long stretches of silence, as if she was sleeping or sitting perfectly still inside her apartment. She also never seemed to leave. Most of the building's residents had routines, jobs to go to, errands to run, social activities that took them out of the complex for hours at a time. But Margaret's car, a beige Chevrolet sedan with a dented rear bumper, remained parked in the same spot day after day. When I did see her, it was always inside the building, checking her mail, carrying a bag of trash to the dumpster, or standing in the hallway outside her door, keys in hand, as if she'd forgotten what she meant to do. Frank thought I was being ridiculous. "Maybe she works from home," he suggested one evening as we watched the news. "Or she's retired. Plenty of people don't leave their apartments much." "She's not old enough to be retired," I said. "And if she works from home, why is she always awake in the middle of the night?" He shrugged, his attention already back on the television. His breathing had been worse lately, a wet, rattling sound that scared me more than I wanted to admit. In early November, something happened that intensified my unease. It was a Tuesday, Around 10:30 in the morning, Frank was asleep in the bedroom. He slept a lot during the day now, exhausted from the effort of simply breathing. I was in the kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes, when I heard a strange sound from upstairs. Not footsteps or furniture moving, but a rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dropped repeatedly on the floor. Thump, thump, thump. I dried my hands and walked into the living room, looking up at the ceiling. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. It went on for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I stood there, listening, but the apartment above me had gone silent again. Later that afternoon, I saw Margaret in the hallway. She was locking her door, her movements quick and furtive, and when she noticed me approaching, she froze for just a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Hello, Dorothy," she said. Her voice was pleasant, but there was something strained beneath it, like a guitar string pulled too tight. "Hi, Margaret. Everything all right?" "Of course. Why do you ask?" "I just, well, I heard some noise this morning from your apartment. I wanted to make sure nothing was wrong." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes did something strange. They went flat, like a doll's eyes, empty of the warmth that should have accompanied the smile. "Oh, that. I was rearranging some boxes in my closet. Sorry if I disturbed you." "No, no, it's fine. I just wanted to check." She nodded once, then turned and walked toward the stairs, her shoes making soft padding sounds on the carpeted floor. I watched her go, that feeling of wrongness settling over me like a cold fog. That night, Frank woke me up around 1:30 a.m., his hand gripping my arm. "Dot," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Do you hear that?" I lay there, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Then I heard it, a low, dragging sound from the apartment above us, as if something heavy were being pulled across the floor. We both stared up at the ceiling, holding our breath. The dragging continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it stopped, followed by the soft click of a door closing. "What the hell is she doing up there?" Frank muttered. "I don't know." "Should we call someone?" "Who? The police? And tell them what? That our upstairs neighbor is moving furniture in the middle of the night?" He didn't answer. We lay there in the dark, listening, but the sounds didn't resume. Over the next week, the pattern repeated itself. Every night, between 1 and 3 a.m., we'd hear Margaret moving around upstairs. Sometimes footsteps, sometimes that dragging sound. Once, what sounded like water running for a very long time. During the day, silence. And every time I saw her, she would smile with that same blank expression, offering some banal courtesy about the weather or the mail delivery. On November 18th, I decided to do something I am not proud of. Frank had a doctor's appointment that afternoon, and I knew Margaret had left the building. I had watched her drive away around noon in her beige Chevrolet. The building manager, a man named Carl Pritchett, kept a master key in his first floor office. I had seen him use it before to check vacant apartments or let residents back inside when they'd locked themselves out. I told myself I only wanted to make sure everything was all right, that I was worried about Margaret's well-being, that maybe she had fallen and needed help, that I was being a good neighbor. But the truth was, I was afraid. And when you're afraid, you start convincing yourself that you have the right to enter someone else's home, even without permission. Carl's office was empty. He was probably somewhere on the property checking on maintenance issues. The master key hung on a pegboard behind his desk, labeled with a strip of masking tape that read, "Master, all units." I took it. My hands were shaking as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was empty, quiet except for the muffled sound of a television playing in one of the other units. I stood outside Margaret's door for a long moment, listening. No sounds from within. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The bolt clicked open. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sunlight. I fumbled for the light switch and flipped it on, flooding the space with harsh fluorescent light. At first glance, the apartment looked normal, Spartan, but normal. A small couch against one wall, a coffee table with a few magazines stacked neatly on top, a kitchenette with clean counters and no dishes in the sink. But then I noticed the smell. Not overwhelming, but present. Something chemical, like bleach or ammonia, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and faintly sweet. I walked deeper into the apartment, my heart hammering in my chest. The bedroom door was closed. I put my hand on the knob, hesitated, then just opened it. The room was empty. No furniture, no curtains, nothing. Just bare walls and a beige carpet that looked freshly shampooed. But in the corner, near the closet, there were stains on the carpet. Dark stains, irregular in shape, that someone had clearly tried to scrub out, but hadn't quite succeeded in removing. I stood there, staring at those stains, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to entertain. Then I heard a sound behind me, a soft creak, like a footstep on old wood. I spun around. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face expressionless, her hands at her sides. She must have come back while I was inside, must have seen her door ajar and come up the stairs without making a sound. "Looking for something, Dorothy?" she asked. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant, but her eyes held that same flat, empty quality I'd seen before. I I'm sorry," I stammered, backing toward the window. "I heard a noise, and I thought—" "You thought you'd let yourself into my apartment without permission. The door was open. I was worried about you." She took a step into the room. "The door wasn't open. I lock it every time I leave." My back hit the wall. "I should go." "Yes," she said softly. "You should." She didn't move to block my path, but I had to squeeze past her to get to the hallway, and as I did, she leaned in close enough that I could smell her breath, mint toothpaste, and something metallic underneath, like blood or rust. "If you ever come into my apartment again," she whispered, "I'll make sure you regret it." I ran down the stairs, through the lobby, into our apartment, where I locked the door and leaned against it, gasping for air. When Frank came home an hour later, I told him everything. He was furious, not at Margaret, but at me, for breaking into her apartment and putting myself at risk. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, pacing the small living room. "She could press charges. She could have hurt you." "Something's wrong with her, Frank. Those stains, those could be anything. Old spills, pet accidents. She doesn't have a pet." "You don't know that." But I did know. I knew in the way you know certain truths without needing evidence. The way your body tells you to run before your brain understands the danger. That night, we heard the sounds again. Louder this time, more deliberate. Dragging, thumping, the scrape of something heavy being moved across the floor directly above our bedroom. It went on for nearly an hour, and neither of us slept. The next morning, I called Carl Pritchett and told him I was concerned about the tenant in 4B, that she was making disturbing noises at night and had threatened me. He promised to look into it, but his tone suggested he thought I was being an anxious old woman making mountains out of molehills. 3 days later, Margaret Dyer disappeared. Her car was gone from the parking lot. Her mailbox filled up with unclaimed letters. And when Carl finally used his master key to check on her, the apartment was empty. Completely empty, as if she'd never been there at all. Even the furniture I'd seen during my unauthorized visit was gone. The only thing left was the smell. That chemical, organic smell that had permeated the entire unit. The police came, eventually. They searched the apartment, brought in some kind of light that made certain substances glow in the dark, and took samples of the carpet. I gave a statement, told them everything I'd seen and heard, including my illegal entry into Margaret's apartment. The detective who interviewed me was a woman in her 30s, with tired eyes and a notepad she filled with cramped handwriting. When I finished my story, she closed the notepad and looked at me for a long moment. "Mrs. Brennan," she said, "what you saw could be consistent with a lot of things. But without a body, without a missing person report, without any evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do. But the stains, we're testing them, but bleach is legal. Moving furniture at night isn't a crime. And unfortunately, scaring your neighbors isn't illegal either." They never found anything concrete. The stains tested positive for blood, human blood, but in insufficient quantities to suggest violence. The prevailing theory was that Margaret had injured herself. A bad nosebleed, maybe, or a cut that bled more than expected, and had panicked and tried to clean it up. But I know what I felt in that apartment. I know what I saw in her eyes. And I know that whatever Margaret Dyer was doing in Unit 4B, it wasn't innocent. We moved out of Riverbend Apartments 3 months later, citing Frank's worsening health as the reason. But the truth is, I couldn't stay there, couldn't sleep beneath that empty apartment, knowing what might have happened in the room above our heads. I've thought about Margaret Dyer often over the years, wondered who she really was, what she was running from, what she might have done. Wondered if she's still out there somewhere, living in another apartment building, keeping strange hours, dragging something heavy across the floor in the dead of night. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think I can still hear it, that rhythmic thumping, that slow dragging sound. And I remember the look in her eyes when she caught me in her apartment, that flat, dead stare that told me I'd glimpsed something I was never meant to see. If this story stayed with you, if you're still thinking about that apartment, those sounds, leave a comment so I know. And if you want to hear the third story, it's the one that finally made me stop trusting closed doors altogether. The house on Sycamore Drive in Burlington, Iowa, was supposed to be our retirement dream. Frank had passed away in 1991, and after 7 years of widowhood, I'd finally decided to stop rattling around in the house we'd shared and find something smaller, more manageable. The place I found was a modest ranch-style home with cream-colored vinyl siding, a neat front lawn, and a screened-in porch that overlooked a quiet cul-de-sac. It was the kind of neighborhood where people kept their yards trim and waved from their driveways on Saturday mornings. The couple next door seemed perfect at first. David and Susan Hammond, both in their early 50s, with matching gray sedans and a golden retriever named Bailey, who barked exactly 3 times whenever someone walked past their fence. David worked as an accountant for a firm in town. I'd see him leave every morning at 7:45 sharp, briefcase in hand, coffee thermos tucked under his arm. Susan was a homemaker, and she took that role seriously. Her flower beds were immaculate, her windows gleamed, and twice a week I'd see her on her hands and knees scrubbing the front steps with a stiff bristled brush and a bucket of soapy water. They introduced themselves the day I moved in, appearing at my front door with a plate of oatmeal cookies wrapped in cellophane and tied with a yellow ribbon. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Susan said, her smile bright and practiced. She was a thin woman with ash blonde hair cut in a bob that curled under at her jawline, and she wore a lavender cardigan even though it was August and pushing 90 degrees. "We're the Hammonds, right next door. If you need anything at all, just holler." David stood slightly behind her, hands in his pockets, nodding along. He was taller than Susan by nearly a foot, with sandy hair going silver at the temples and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. "We keep a quiet street here," he said. "Everyone looks out for each other." "That's wonderful," I said, accepting the cookies. "I'm Dorothy. Dorothy Brennan. Just me, I'm afraid. My husband passed several years ago." Susan's face rearranged itself into an expression of practiced sympathy. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Well, you just let us know if you need help with anything. Heavy lifting, yard work, anything at all. They seemed genuine, kind, even. The sort of neighbors anyone would be grateful to have. For the first few months, everything was pleasant. Susan would wave from her garden when I checked my mail. David would offer to help carry groceries if he happened to be outside when I returned from the store. Bailey would trot over to the fence when I worked in my yard, tail wagging, pushing his nose through the chain link in hopes of getting scratched behind the ears. But sometime in November, I want to say around the 10th or 11th, things began to shift in ways I couldn't immediately name. Small things at first, barely noticeable. I started hearing them arguing. Not loud, knockdown fights, but tense, hissing exchanges that would drift over the fence late at night when I sat on my screened porch with a cup of tea. I couldn't make out specific words, just the cadence of it. Susan's voice rising in pitch, strained and insistent, and David's low rumble of response, clipped and dismissive. Then there was the matter of Susan's routine. For months, she'd been outside every morning by 8 a.m., tending to her garden or sweeping the driveway or washing windows. But suddenly, she stopped. Days would go by without me seeing her at all. The flower beds went unweeded, leaves piled up on their front steps. Bailey's barking became more frequent, more frantic, as if he wasn't being let outside as often as he needed. I told myself it wasn't my business. Maybe Susan was sick. Maybe they were having marital problems. Every couple goes through rough patches. Lord knows Frank and I had our share. But then came the night of December the 3rd. I woke up around 2:15 a.m. to the sound of a car door slamming. Not unusual in itself. People keep odd hours, come home late from work or social obligations. But something about the sound pulled me out of sleep with a jolt of unease I couldn't explain. I got out of bed and walked to the window that overlooked the Hammonds' driveway. The street light on the corner cast everything in harsh, sodium yellow light. David's sedan was parked in the driveway, trunk open. As I watched, he emerged from the house, carrying something wrapped in a dark blanket. Something large and awkward, the size and shape of a rolled-up carpet. He struggled with it, grunting with effort as he maneuvered it into the trunk. It took him several tries to get it positioned correctly. And even from my window, I could see the strain on his face, the sweat on his forehead despite the December cold. Once the trunk was loaded, he slammed it shut, got into the car, and backed out of the driveway. The taillights disappeared down Sycamore Drive, heading toward the main road. I stood at the window for a long time after he left, my heart beating too fast, my mind turning over what I'd just seen. There were plenty of innocent explanations, I told myself. He could have been taking old carpet to the dump, or moving furniture for a friend, or hauling away trash that wouldn't fit in the weekly pickup. But none of those explanations felt right. Not at 2:15 in the morning. Not with the furtive way he'd moved, glancing over his shoulder as he loaded the trunk. And not when Susan still hadn't appeared by the time dawn broke. I didn't see David return that night. When I woke up the next morning around 7 a.m., his car was back in the driveway, parked in its usual spot, as if it had never left. But Susan's sedan, the gray Honda Accord she drove to the grocery store every Thursday, was gone. Over the next week, I kept watch. I know how that sounds, like I was some paranoid old woman spying on her neighbors out of boredom or malice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And the more I observed, the more that feeling intensified. Susan's car never came back. David maintained his routine, leaving at 7:45, returning at 5:30, letting Bailey out for exactly 10 minutes before calling him back inside. But there were differences. He stopped taking Bailey for walks. He let the mail pile up in the box by the front door until it overflowed and spilled onto the porch. And every evening, around 8 p.m., he'd go into the garage and stay there for hours. I could see the light on through the small window, could hear the faint sound of movement, things being shifted, tools being used, the occasional scrape of metal on concrete. On December 10th, I called my daughter Linda in Des Moines and told her what I'd seen. "Mom," she said, her voice patient but concerned, "you can't jump to conclusions. Maybe Susan left him. Maybe she went to visit family. Maybe they're separated and he doesn't want to talk about it. For a week, without taking any of her things? How do you know she didn't take her things?" "I just know," she sighed. "Have you considered that maybe this isn't your concern? You've been through a lot, Mom. With Dad and the move and everything. Sometimes stress makes us see things that aren't there." But I wasn't imagining things. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that David Hammond was hiding something. On December 12th, I did something I'd sworn I'd never do again after the incident with Margaret Dyer. I went somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. This is the moment that matters. If you suspected something was wrong, but had no proof, would you cross that line and look? Or would you protect yourself and walk away? It was a Thursday afternoon. David left for work at his usual time, and I knew from months of observation that he wouldn't return until after 5:30. I walked across my lawn, through the gap in our hedges, and into the Hammonds' backyard. Bailey started barking the moment he saw me through the sliding glass door. I knelt down and spoke to him softly through the glass, and after a moment, his barking subsided into anxious whining. He looked thin, I noticed. His ribs were showing through his golden coat, and his water bowl, visible on the kitchen floor, was empty. I tried the back door. Locked. The windows were all locked too. But the garage had a side entrance, a wooden door with a simple lock that looked old and loose in its frame. I jiggled the handle, and to my surprise, it opened. The garage was dim, lit only by the gray afternoon light filtering through that one small window. It took my eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, I saw that the space was obsessively organized. Tools hung on hooks, paint cans arranged by size on metal shelves, and along the far wall, a workbench where everything was lined up in neat squares and labeled. But in the center of the garage, covering most of the concrete floor, was a large blue tarp. And beneath the tarp was a pile of something irregular, creating strange lumps and angles beneath the surface. That was when I should have left. I should have walked out of that garage, called the police, and let them handle it. But I didn't. I stepped closer to the tarp and lifted one corner. Bags. Heavy-duty black contractor bags, the kind used for construction debris, sealed with strips of packing tape. Maybe 10 or 12 of them stacked in a crude pyramid. I touched one of the bags. It was soft and pliable, nothing like a bag filled with tools or scrap wood. And it was cold, far colder than the temperature inside the garage. My hands were shaking as I clawed at the tape sealing the nearest bag. After several tries, I finally managed to open it enough to see inside. Fabric, dark fabric, maybe denim or cotton, crushed tightly together. I pulled it out, and when it unfolded, I saw what it was. A woman's jacket. A lavender cardigan with pearl buttons. It was Susan's cardigan. I dropped it and stumbled back, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The garage felt suddenly smaller, the air too heavy, the walls closing in. I had to get out. I had to call the police. "Can I help you with something, Dorothy?" I turned around. David stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon light, his briefcase still in his hand. He must have come home early. He must have seen me go into his garage and followed me. I I was looking for Bailey," I stammered, backing toward the workbench. "He ran outside, and I thought maybe—" "Bailey's inside," David said calmly. He set down his briefcase and took a step into the garage. "He's been inside all day, so that's not true, is it?" "David, I think we need to talk about Susan." He smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. "Is that what you want to talk about? Where Susan went?" "The police? The police don't care about Susan," he said, taking another step forward. "Susan left me. That's what I'll tell them. She took her car, drove off, and I haven't heard from her since. Happens every day. Marriages fall apart. Spouses leave. No one's going to investigate that." "But her clothes? They're in bags because I'm donating them," he said smoothly, "getting rid of the things that remind me of her. I'm moving on with my life. That's what people do, Dorothy. They move on." He was close enough now that I could smell him. Coffee, aftershave, and beneath that, a sharp chemical scent that stung my eyes. "I'm going to call my daughter," I said, trying to steady my voice. "She's expecting me to call. If I don't, she'll come looking for me." David tilted his head, studying me. "Is that so?" "Yes." For a long moment, we just stared at each other in that dim garage. Then David smiled again, that same empty smile and stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Then you'd better go call her," he said. "I wouldn't want her to worry." I didn't run. Even though my legs trembled and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, I forced myself to walk past him slowly, calmly, as though unafraid. I cut across his yard, slipped through the bushes into my own home, and locked every door and window. Then I called 112 in a panic. The police arrived within 20 minutes. From my living room window, I watched two officers knock on David's door, speak to him briefly, and then follow him into the garage. They stayed inside for about 10 minutes before coming out with the bags. David was arrested that evening. The bags, as I'd suspected, contained Susan's belongings. Not just her cardigan, but other clothes, personal items, and ultimately, evidence that led them to her body. He'd buried her in a wooded area off County Road 18, about 15 miles outside of town. The medical examiner determined she'd been dead since December 3rd, the same night I'd seen David loading his trunk. The trial happened the following summer. I testified about what I'd seen and heard, though David's attorney tried to paint me as a paranoid widow with an overactive imagination. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. Susan had died from blunt force trauma to the head. They'd been arguing about money, about David's gambling debts, about Susan's threat to leave and take half of everything. He'd hit her with a hammer from the garage workbench. Then he'd panicked and tried to cover it up. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. I sold the house on Sycamore Drive 6 months later. Couldn't stay there, couldn't sleep knowing what had happened just on the other side of that hedge. My granddaughter helped me find a small apartment in a senior community where the doors have good locks and security cameras watch the parking lot. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about Susan Hammond, about how she smiled when she brought me those cookies, how she kept her flower beds so perfect, how she wore that lavender cardigan even in the August heat, about how she lived right next door to me, close enough that I could have heard her scream, and I never knew she was in danger until it was too late. That's the thing about neighbors. You see them every day. You wave, exchange pleasantries, borrow cups of sugar. But you never really know what's happening behind those closed doors. Never know what secrets are being kept in garages and basements and spaces you're not supposed to see. And that's what keeps me up at night now, more than anything else. Not the memory of Mr. Oleander watching my daughters, or Margaret Dyer dragging something heavy across her floor, or even David Hammond loading his wife's body into his trunk. It's the knowledge that somewhere, right now, there's another Susan, another person who smiles and waves and keeps their yard tidy while something terrible happens just out of sight. And we, their neighbors, never know until it's far too late. We all like to believe we would notice. We like to believe we would act. Before you leave, ask yourself and then tell me in the comments, would you really?